Welcome to the recorded version of the Grantmakers in Aging webinar, The Economic Case for Age-Friendly Communities, from July 20th, 2016. This Conversations with GIA event features Dr. Margaret Neal, Director of the Institute on Aging and Professor at Portland State University, Catherine Lawler, Director of the Area Agency on Aging, Atlantic Regional Commission, and Catherine Boyer-Schessel, Project Manager at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Commission. This event was made possible by a partnership with the John A. Hartford Foundation and AARP Foundation.
I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us today to talk about this important issue. Capturing the attention of elected officials and the business community on the value of age-friendly communities is critical to sustaining efforts to create age-friendly efforts. Documenting the economic impact of the 65-plus population is one powerful strategy. Our speakers today are going to provide the insights on how economic analyses conducted in their regions on the 65-plus population can be used and how those data were used to create successful messaging strategies to influence elected officials, corporate leaders, city and regional planners, and other decision makers. A business case synthesizing the results of these analyses and related efforts is also going to be shared. Very pleased to have three outstanding national leaders to guide us through this process. Dr. Margaret Neal is Director of the Institute on Aging and Professor of Community Health at Portland State University. Cathy Boyer-Schessel is the Project Manager of KC Communities for All Ages at the Mid-America Regional Council in Kansas City area. And Catherine Lawler is the Director of the Area Agency on Aging at the Atlanta Regional Commission. I want to welcome all of you. Margaret, let's start with you. Tell us about the results of your research on the economic impact of age-friendly communities.
Thanks, John. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about this work. Next slide, please. What we're doing in this case is, as commissioned by Grantmakers in Aging, we wanted to go to the literature to identify all of the research that exists to describe why creating an age-friendly community is a good idea, and the various reasons that all the target audiences that we identified could utilize to make this decision to work in this area. And the target audiences for the case are government officials and staff, members of the business community, investors, philanthropists, educators, civic groups, advocacy organizations, service organizations, and service providers, and then community residents themselves. And I'll just draw your attention to the diagram here on the right, which is a diagram of the age-friendly domains. Normally there are 8 in our Portland area. We pulled 2 of them apart, and so we have 10, but they focus on the built environment, the social environment, and the service environment, and really have to do with all of the areas in which our lives influence how we are going to age in community. Next slide, please. What we did in developing this case for age-friendly communities is, as I said, we reviewed the academic literature, but also the gray literature, things like Huffington Post and other credible sources, to uncover the most recent and relevant information that we could that would help to make this case for age-friendly communities. We also consulted with experts. We had a number of iterations of the document, and it was finally formatted and released by Grantmakers in Aging on March 7th of this year. Could you fast forward, please? Next slide. This is just a picture of the table of contents. So there's an executive summary of the case. There's a section called Setting the Stage, where we just provide a very few statistics on population aging, on the concept of older adults as a growing resource, on the concept of an age-friendly community and how it can benefit people of all ages, and then who should care about this issue of aging and why. And then we go into various reasons that constitute the value proposition of an age-friendly community, and these include the economic benefits and social capital benefits, as well as opportunities related to housing and physical infrastructure, health benefits, and other benefits. And it's a very detailed document in terms of its documentation of the research. So anyone who wants to go and find the source for the statement that we've just made in the case can do so through a fairly extensive section of endnotes. Next slide, please. So I'll talk first just about the economic benefits that we uncovered in the literature. And one of the most important ones is that older adults constitute an important part of the workforce, and they can expand the labor pool from which employers can hire, which is increasingly an issue. We are beginning to see labor shortages in certain fields, and older adults can help fill those gaps. We also know from research that older workers as a whole can really work to enhance organizational productivity and business outcomes. They've been shown to be very reliable workers and very productive workers. We've also got documentation in the literature about how attracting and retaining older adults in the community who might otherwise leave can be an important economic development strategy. And both Cathy and Catherine, our other speakers today, are going to address studies in that regard that they have conducted. We also know from the literature that older adults start more new businesses than younger adults. Everyone realizes that older adults have tremendous economic clout as consumers, and basically the older adult market is stimulating new companies and products, services, and technologies. And then finally, older adults bring tourism dollars if you happen to be in an area that is a tourist destination. Next slide, please. There are also social and health benefits associated with age-friendly communities. One of the ones that I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute is the fact that older adults provide care and resources across generations. They also are key volunteers in our communities and tend to be, as a group, one of the most civically engaged in communities. And if we create communities that are age-friendly, we can reduce the barriers to volunteering and therefore utilize older adults as really the only growing natural resource that we have. So it behooves communities to work on becoming more age-friendly. Older adults also are donors. They make philanthropic investments and charitable contributions. And if we create age-friendly environments that reduce social isolation, that makes it easier for people to have healthy lives, to be engaged in the community, and it results in lower public and personal costs related to illness and health care. So there are many benefits in the area of both social and health that and the political and environmental fabric of society that are made by older adults. Next slide, please. So to this issue of volunteering, which obviously contributes to the economic development of a community, but also to individual health, some data from the Corporation for National and Community Service from 2014 showed that older adults volunteered almost 2 billion hours of service, which was valued at $45.7 billion. Almost a quarter of people aged 65 and over volunteered. And communities benefit and nonprofit organizations benefit from these volunteer hours, but so do older adults themselves. And there's considerable research in this arena that shows that older adults gain a sense of purpose and accomplishment. This increases life satisfaction, and it also leads to better physical, mental, and cognitive health. Next slide, please. Age-friendly communities that help retain older adults benefit from the charitable contributions that are made by these older adults. And research by AARP showed that 3/4 of people in midlife and older ages engaged in charitable giving in 2013. Bequest produced over $28.13 billion in charitable contributions, which is about 60%, more than 60%, than the gifts from businesses and corporations. So it's obviously a huge component of the charitable contributions that we benefit in the U.S. from. Next slide, please. And age-friendly communities facilitate caregiving by older adults, which contributes to the economy. So just looking at some of the data with regard to the unpaid care that is provided by older adults care for their adult children, their grandchildren, their spouses, other relatives, and also friends and neighbors. And a study by AARP in 2015 estimated that about 37 billion hours of care were provided annually by family caregivers. This is people of all ages, but it's primarily middle-aged and older people who are the family caregivers. And the value of that caregiving was $470 billion, which actually is more than our national Medicaid expenditures, and also more than the combined annual sales for 4 very major companies: Apple, IBM, Hewlett, and Microsoft. Next slide, please. And there are social, economic, and political benefits that come along with creating age-friendly communities. We know that older adults interact with their neighbors more, so that builds a sense of neighborhood cohesion. And older adults are also a group that's extremely active in caring for place through their volunteer efforts, their advocacy by giving advice and support, and affecting change. And I'd like to just call your attention to the quote on the right by United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. "Trees grow stronger over the years, rivers wider. Likewise, with age, human beings gain immeasurable depth and breadth of experience and wisdom. That is why older adults should not only be respected and revered, they should be utilized as the rich resource to society that they are." Next slide, please. So in summary, we conclude our case statement with this particular statement. What we do now to make our communities good places to grow up and grow old will yield results not only for today's elders, but also tomorrow's, which is for all of us. And this is a link to the full report and the executive summary of the full report, and I look forward to your questions later in the webinar. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Margaret. This is really an outstanding effort that the field has long needed, so we're very proud to be associated with you on this. Next, we're going to turn to Cathy, who's going to talk to us about a great example at the local level and the regional level. So Cathy, could you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in the Kansas City region to bring this kind of research to a more regional level?
Sure, thanks, John. And while it's moving to the next, you can move to another slide as well. I just want to say how much that Kansas City is using the Portland State University's report that Margaret just talked about. It's probably the most well-researched document out there. And we're using that widely here in Kansas City, and so appreciate her work, or the work of Portland State as well. So the Mid-America Regional Council, and the acronym that I may be referring to a couple times in my presentation is MARC, which is the acronym for Mid-America Regional Council. And just so that you'll have a sense of who we are, we're the association of city and county governments in the Kansas City region that covers 2 state lines, Kansas and Missouri, 9 counties, and 119 local municipalities. We cover a broad and vast area of departments and services in the Kansas City area that are listed on that slide. The KC Communities for All Ages, which, if I refer to that again, that acronym is KCC. So for the benefit, I'm only using two acronyms in my presentation. So the next slide. The KC Communities for All Ages initiative is our age-friendly community initiative in the Kansas City region, and currently we have official participation of 12 communities, and we're in conversations with about 4 or 5 additional that we hope to add this year. So in our age-friendly community efforts, we've experienced a degree of frustration with the lack of engagement of in particular, business leaders and elected officials, with their embracing an initiative that values the contributions of older adults. Most seem to be seeking strategies to attract and retain the millennial generation. So to assist us in our messaging to move the needle on increasing understanding and appreciation of business and local government, our research department at MARC conducted an economic impact analysis of our region 65+ population. And I need to just take out a second here to give a nod and a thank you to Atlanta Regional Council for giving us this idea. Presentations on this analysis by far have been the most positive impact on this audience, garnering what we're told are record attendance at groups such as Rotary and Chambers. And since I attend these, I can attest that it's eliciting interesting and engaged discussion. So this strategy has really paid off in Kansas City. Next slide, please. You have access to the document, which I'm really not going to go through deeply today, but you do have access to the document to download later. The analysis covers the demographic shift, the workforce, employment, earnings, spending, education, and migration patterns. Next slide, please. The one slide that I did want to, or the one graphic that I wanted to pull out for this presentation that's really garnering the most attention, the most surprise, and the most discussion is that older households are spending as much as younger households on average. Though senior wages may lag, their expenditures are still roughly equal to those of younger households due to spending out of retirement savings and income from Social Security. In the United States, households with heads aged 75 years and greater spend $34,400 annually, or about 13% more than those headed by individuals under the age of 25. Households headed by individuals 65 to 74 spend roughly $46,000 per year, or about only 3% less than the average household headed by individuals between the ages of 25 and 34. So as I mentioned, when the audience see this graph, it really becomes an aha moment that in terms of total expenditures, that the older adults are spending as much as the age group that they're salivating to recruit and retain in their communities. So just wanted to make sure that you did see this slide. So the next slide, very briefly, is going on to explain the case for retaining the Kansas City region's 65+ population. So the next slide, please. So our research department, to gauge the potential impact of policies and investments by local governments to make communities more accessible and attractive to an aging population, the research department assumed for purposes of this analysis that such efforts could reduce the current average annual gross out-migration seniors per year by 10%. Given an annual average gross out-migration of 6,000 per year between 2007 and 2013, such a reduction would result in retaining an additional 600 adults average or age 65 years and over each year. Now this is an assumption, and that assumption was then put into MARC's economic model of the Kansas City metropolitan areas developed by the Regional Economic Models, and that's REMI, so I was wrong. There's three acronyms in this presentation. So the REMI model was used to conduct this forecast and the analysis. So using the policy variables in the REMI model, MARC was able to simulate the impact of retaining an additional 600 individuals ages 65+ each year over a 10-year period from 2013 through 2023. The REMI model used data on the average income seniors as well as the pattern of consumer expenditures by age. The REMI model converted these additional people into an increase in the demand for output across all the industries in the KC region. It further estimated how much of that demand would result in purchases from local businesses as opposed to businesses elsewhere in the United States or the rest of the world. Only the local purchases stimulate the regional economy. Finally, it used data on input-output relationships across industries to estimate the impact of the initial purchases on supplier industries and their workers, the suppliers of the supplier industries, and so on. And this process runs until a new equilibrium, is reached. So the next slide, please. So some of the results are retaining more seniors produces a cumulative effect on the region's economy. And using the analysis again and the assumption of keeping 600 people, older adults, per year over the next 10 years, results in nearly 7,000 more people and 2,600 more jobs if continued for the 10 years. And the next slide. And also more people and jobs in the region would raise annual incomes by nearly $500 million and the value of goods and services produced locally by nearly $250 million. So income rises faster than output because our older adults bring with them retirement income for which they don't have to work at local firms to enjoy. And in addition, some of their income is spent on goods and services not produced locally. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, and this is much like what Margaret just shared with us, that our older adults are an increasing share of the economy, resulting in both growing numbers and improved spending power. Retaining seniors who might otherwise leave can be an important part of an overall economic development strategy. Strategies that make the region more attractive to older adults could add thousands of jobs and millions of dollars to our region's economy over time. So finally, one of our messages is that we are increasingly a community of all ages. So the investments are important for cities to make and for businesses to consider, and other sectors as well, as Margaret's presentation showed, that we're increasingly investments to become a community for all ages. And I think that that's then the next slide, I believe, may just be contact information.
And so it is. Cathy, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We look forward to your questions. And speaking of which, I want to remind you that we will be having time for questions at the end of the next presentation. So I want to ask you as participants to go ahead and start typing in your question. You will see a box on the right part of your screen. If you go down and find the place where it says questions, you open up that box and you can type in your questions at any point. We already have a number of questions that have been submitted, and we'll be doing that after this next presentation. So with that, Catherine, let's move to Atlanta and the Atlanta region. Tell us about some of the work that you've been doing down there.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. It's always such a great pleasure to be with Margaret and John and Cathy, and such exceptional colleagues. I want to just highlight and maybe pick up right where Cathy left off. As she mentioned, we also began looking at some of these issues around the economic impact of older residents of the Atlanta region here, and found, as Candace did, to be a little bit surprised by some of the information we saw, but also about this extraordinary opportunity, the doors that have become open to us to engage non-traditional partners because of what this data is showing us across our region. So I want to just give you some very high-level highlights from that analysis, just to show you that the same analysis done in two places, Kansas and Atlanta, both were compelling messages, but we are different kinds of communities, and so we had a little bit of different results. One of the first things we found, if you could switch the slide, please, is that right away, older adults are really actively contributing to our economy right now, that they are annually producing about $1 billion in wages, and that was surprising to most, even those who run our economic model for the region, that the idea that everyone would already be retired by 65 and have moved to Florida to have a good time is not carried out by the data about what we know about our economy. That really prompted a lot of questions about who is in our labor force. If you could move to the next slide, please. And just to show you, this is happening certainly in many parts of the country, but what's going on here in Atlanta, we looked back a little bit and at the age distribution of our labor force, and you'll see that we had very small numbers of people over the ages of 60, actually, 65 over the age of 70, who were participating in the labor force in 1990. And that's how we remember Atlanta, as a young place where young people were coming to work. But looking ahead at current data, so the next slide is actually from 2013, where you can see that we already have started to experience a growth in the 60-plus population participating in the labor force. So our ideas of ourselves that might be a little frozen in 1990 are actually, we have a very different reality right now. And then we were able to project what it might look like moving forward. And so the next slide shows you 2040, where we're really expecting a pretty dramatic increase in older people working in the labor force. And in our region, a lot of that is due to the disproportionate numbers of Generation X who live in our region and what age groups they will fall in by 2040. But as many of you know on the phone, it's also due to the active, healthier, older population that is coming along, and of course many people's need to work longer. And I like to just show on this next slide, in 1 week in the New York Times, we had both an article about how important it was to let older people keep working for their own financial health, and then the next slide, just a couple days later, there was an article about how businesses really aren't going to be able to thrive unless they can find a way to keep their older workers. And our analysis bared this out. The next slide shows you our regional labor force participation rates. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm the AAA director. I didn't even really know what a labor force participation rate was. But we've learned a lot through this process, as have the economists who've been helping us do the analysis. And this is not the trend line any community wants to see about its labor force participation rate. You really don't. You need it to hold steady, and certainly don't want it to decrease. And the bulk of this is attributed to older people leaving the workforce. So, it's important for older workers, it is important for businesses, and we learned it's very important for our region's economic health if we can think differently about continuing to engage the time and talents of people over 60 in our workforce. Like Cathy in Kansas, we also began to run an experiment just to try to understand this overall impact. So yes, they're producing wages, and yes, we know for a lot of good reasons older people are an important part of our economic engine. But we really do have this idea that our economic future in the Sun Belt generally is based on young people coming and working. And most of our economic development strategies in communities around the region reflect that same idea. So we ran an experiment, and this plays out just quickly on the next slide, where we just said, what if 1,000 more people over the age of 65 move to the metro region each year between now and 2040? And you'll see that that has a pretty significant impact. They produce $40 billion in personal income and $7.8 billion in additional GDP for our region. And that's interesting. They all seem like big numbers, but we asked the same question and said, well, what if 1,000 people between the ages of 18 and 64 move to the metro Atlanta region? And on the next slide, you'll see the results. And it's been surprising to almost everybody who would have assumed that more people between the ages of 18 and 64 would have a greater impact on our economy than those over 65, and in fact, that's not the case. Now, it was just an experiment, and we are not enacting a public policy to grab another 1,000 people over the age of 65 to our region, but it has been a powerful illustration about the role that they are playing overall in the economy. So next, I just wanted to transition to share with you some work that many of us, several communities around the country, who've really begun to understand that we need to advance the work of preparing our communities for the growth in the older adult population. We really do need to bring in wide range of partners and to be able to begin to pull some levers to get some of the great work we've been doing to scale. And this understanding the economic impact and the incredible research that's being done out at Portland State has really been a really powerful fuel for that. But a number of us have begun to work on trying to understand how the value shows up on essentially the day-to-day, the annual, or the multi-year plans and financial investments that communities are making. And it comes really from this realization, this is the next slide, it's just a sort of silly illustration, that we all know that we need more resources to address these issues. We're demonstrating the power that older people are playing in our communities, and we might need to look in different places for the resources we need to affect the kind of change that we know communities need to invest in if they really are going to be able to support and ensure that people of all ages can thrive in their communities. And so as a group, we began to study a model that some of you may be familiar with that is very simply represented on the next slide, which is called Capture and Reinvest. So where we begin to understand when good things are created, things that have value, and particularly value that can be quantified, how can we make sure to align any savings that's produced or any economic benefit that's produced from that intervention so that some of that benefit returns to sustain the intervention. So essentially when savings is accrued or economic power is harnessed, as in some of the work Cathy and I have been demonstrating, how do we ensure that those benefits go to continue to drive the interventions that make that possible? So in this case, how can we ensure that the benefits that older people are bringing to the community are realized in such a way that community investments are made to make it possible for those older people to be healthy and active in their community? And it's just a new way of thinking. A lot of folks are using it with social impact bonds. Many of you have probably seen some of this work before. The next slide is just a really great example of how the health community is looking at this, for example, on issues around prevention. So when maybe say a community-based intervention achieves health savings, keeps people healthier, perhaps maybe prevents smoking. So if you launch a community initiative to prevent smoking, and it's successful because you follow evidence-based protocols, when fewer people smoke, we know that that brings value. It brings value to different parts of the healthcare system because those individuals are now less expensive, and it brings value to the workplace as individuals who are not sick as often are able to be more productive, and so forth. And so in the Capture and Reinvest model, begin to line up the entities that will experience that savings and help them become investors in the intervention itself. Because with our work in Age Friendly, we know that we're not going to be able to transform our communities overnight, and we need a multi-year, possibly multi-decade approach to transforming our communities, and we're going to have to not fund them program by program or just grant by grant, though those are important. We really are going to have to think about helping the money flow differently so that it is able to sustain the kind of interventions we're looking for. So in some initial work that we were able to do as a team and with the support of grant makers in aging, we began to look at what could these value propositions be that might begin to steer financing in a different direction. And just 3 of them to give you a taste of what this work is like. There's a lot more research that we still need to do. But a couple examples. So while we have for a very long time advocated for aging in community, aging in place, which is clearly a very important goal and one that many individuals hold for themselves, there is another way to look at the outcome of when you are successful at ensuring that people can age in the community. You have a diversified tax base, meaning you have people of a variety of different ages, a diversified age structure living in the community together. And that can be very helpful for a number of reasons. It means that people are accessing things in different ways. They have different spending habits. You might have a lunchtime crowd at a restaurant if the neighborhood has people who aren't going to work every day, as well as a dinner crowd because there are people in the neighborhood who come home and don't have time to cook and need to go out. So an aging in community certainly achieves the goal for older people, but it is very likely creating specific economic value by generating a diversified tax base. It also, when you have an age-diversified community, when older people have been able to remain in the community, not everybody is putting their children into elementary school at the same time or the middle school, so there might be opportunities to understand the value of a more even use of community resources like that. We also looked at, one of the most pressing issues to make a community more age-friendly is to provide more transportation options, and how, when that is being done and done well, it actually solves larger problems for the transportation system. So we began to understand that when communities provide a wide range of transportation options, from volunteer programs to voucher programs to, these days, even programs that help older adults use ride-sharing programs like Uber and Lyft, that those communities that are rich in transportation options can actually reduce dependence on the traditional paratransit system. And the costs of paratransit are becoming very difficult for many local transportation authorities to manage. And so by generating, if you will, that savings, or by certainly deferring costs, there is value that is coming as a result of those transportation options that goes beyond just the value provided to the older person. And lastly, again, to mention the diversified age structure, how that means that people, I mentioned already, using community resources like schools differently, but it also means that in a time when many communities across the country are struggling to find the resources they need to maintain their infrastructure, the infrastructure around roads and bridges, all of which, many of which were built 50 years ago and are now needing significant maintenance, local governments are really struggling with this issue. And when you have an age-diversified community, you have diversified use of your transportation infrastructure as well. So that means not everybody is using the same exit ramp to get on the highway in the morning to commute downtown to work, and they're not all using it at the same time in the evening, that you actually have the opportunity to maximize that infrastructure in a more efficient way when a community is full of different people doing different things at different times of the day. So I want to leave you with a couple of those thoughts. These are work. It's so exciting to be a part of a collective of communities across the country where we find more than often we have many of the same opportunities and challenges, and yet when we study each other's local flavor, the inspiration and new ideas that brings. These are just a few of those that I think we've done in Atlanta, but we've also done collectively with our colleagues. And the next slide is simply my contact information as well.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much. As you say, this has been a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. We now have time for our questions, and we've got a lot of questions so far, but please go ahead and continue to ask your questions by going to the question box that's on the right side of your screen. Simply open that section and type in your questions, and I will be asking them to our panelists. So, Cathy, we'll actually start with you. It's a question about basically who brings the message. So the question is, who do you find is most effective in bringing a message about the economic role of older persons in a community? Is it the traditional area agency on aging director, or the people from the political system, or others?
Well, in the case of Kansas City, our lead researcher, his name is Frank Lank, is well known across the country. He's the primary economic forecaster, and he's the one that we generally schedule around his schedule. The folks that belong to Rotaries and Chambers know Mr. Link, actually it's Dr. Link now, and he's a draw. And while you heard in my presentation where I read his words, he actually understands what he's talking about. He ran the analysis. This is what he does. Kind of peer to peer. That Frank is one of the peers of at least the audiences that we're trying to have impact with the most, which are elected officials and business leaders. So from our experience, it would be folks that are economists or business people. We're in the process now of training members of our advisory board who are retired business people who have name recognition or their resume would give credibility. So in our experience is that the most influential person to bring this message would be economists and business people.
And I think that, just to follow up slightly with that, I mean, certainly I think all of us can say that it is not typical for the communities we're trying to reach with this message to basically believe this stuff. So, Catherine, could you talk a little bit about when you showed in your analysis from the model that having 1,000 older people is 10 times more valuable than younger people, what's been the reaction to that analysis?
In general, everyone is very surprised because it's really breaking down their ideas of what older people in Atlanta are. And then it immediately goes to, hey, how can we make sure that we are attracting and retaining older people in our community? So it can go right into the weeds on, say, for example, housing. So while the millennials and older people have much in common with the kind of housing they need, there are specific design issues that are very important to older people. So we can go quickly from those slides I just shared with you to a detailed conversation about the need for universal design, and that while millennials are more likely to be living in a roommate situation versus older people who might want to have enough space for a dining room table and to have 4 people over for dinner. So we can get right into the weeds on that because there isn't really a community in Atlanta. Well, like Cathy's experience, it's a credible source, and so we don't usually have too much time of disbelief. And so once it's out there, they want to know how they can use that to harness that power in their own community.
Margaret, this is a question for you. The question is about communities that are already older, so they're 20 or 30% older and are going to very rapidly become older than that. Does this model really apply to them as well? Do we know that, in fact, it's a success? Age-friendly communities can be a successful strategy in those kind of communities as well?
I think that I have to say right off the bat that I don't know for sure the answer to the question. I think in some rural communities, which is where you're most likely to find these sort of superannuated communities, if there's been an economic decline for a long time and the primary reason that the population is composed principally of older adults is due to economic decline, then that community has a lot of work to do in order to be age-friendly and in order to turn itself around and be an economically viable community. Alternatively, there are other communities. For example, I'm thinking of Bend, Oregon, in the center of our state, and it's a retiree magnet, and its economy is absolutely booming. The housing market's going crazy, building market, consumers are spending a lot of money, and it's one of the fastest growing cities in the U.S. So I think it depends on the reason for the aging of the population. Is it newer people moving in, or is it basically younger people moving out, leaving only the older adults?
Okay, thanks. Back to you, Cathy. With a suggestion, what format was used to disseminate this economic information to the business leaders and elected officials? Did you schedule community forums? I think you mentioned that. Where everyone's invited? Do you try to get a private meeting with the mayor or other people? Talk a little bit more about the strategy you used there.
Okay, we use a variety of strategies. When we did conduct some focus groups during before it was the final print, just to get some reactions. And we had a number of focus groups, which that was during the development phase. But I think that we probably have presented to a dozen chambers and a dozen rotaries in the region, and word of mouth has been an important strategy because they talk to each other. And so word of mouth. We also sent out, Mark has a pretty elaborate communication system with local jurisdictions and other industries in our region. So it's been, the link to the report has been distributed really quite widely. With our work with the recognition program, which is our age-friendly community program that provides an intentional, structured way for local jurisdictions that agree to participate, we use we supply the report to every elected official, and we reference the key points in all of our presentations to the City Council, the department heads when we meet with them, and the planning commissions and other commissions. So we really haven't, John, created a vast, comprehensive public awareness or public outreach, but the strategy has been more that when we have a chance to be in more intimate settings with folks that are already indicating an interest to learn more and what they might do as an elected official or a public works director, for example. And I think that this is, and I'm trying to think if it was Margaret or Catherine or both who referenced this, that this report offers a really good entree for them to think past their general reluctance to think about older adults as an important sector for them to consider for their community. And when Catherine said, she was the one who said universal design, it's a great entree to begin to introduce the fundamental concepts of age-friendly communities, from the built environment pieces of that to the social and service. It's served as a really great entree to where the audience is more receptive to think of the broader implications.
Thanks. Catherine, back to you. I think both you and Cathy talked about the REMI model, and if you could explain a little bit more about that model, but also are there other economic models that are being used in this area that local communities should know about?
Yes, so REMI is actually a private company, and many regions like ours in Atlanta and in Kansas, they are charged with doing economic modeling and have chosen to use the REMI software and the REMI very detailed data as their major tool to do that, just like a mapping software and a subscription to mapping data. It isn't everywhere, but it is not as uncommon as you might think. So anyone who's interested, it's definitely worth a look into their regional commission or council of governments, or who even some universities who are actively doing these models. It really, I don't want to speak for Cathy's colleague, but it didn't really take us much to make these queries of the analysis. However, and I know Cathy has experienced this too, that every time we talk about what we did in Atlanta, we get some great interest from lots of communities around the country, and so we're actively helping a community in Pennsylvania right now get pretty close to what we have, even though they do not have anything but a state economic model. It's a smaller community. So it was a great challenge for us to have to think about how, using other existing public data sources, you might actually be able to get at, about 85% of this information. So we're doing that with them now, and we'll look at trying to nail down our methodology on that, how we do it, and be happy to share it with any community that doesn't have REMI as well. As Cathy mentioned, we got this started in Atlanta, but we've been delighted to share it with anybody who's interested. And then we've also had our staff help communities in other places think differently about how they might do this.
Wonderful. Margaret, back to you with a more explicit question about rural, using these models in rural areas. You've done basically the most comprehensive analysis that anyone's ever done in this area. What kinds of information have you found about the impact of age-friendly communities in rural settings in general? What's the need for more research and information about these areas?
There's really very little research that's focused on age-friendly communities in rural areas. The bulk of it that has been done in Canada, and so there are a few reports that that are accessible to communities to look at those, but there's really very little. So I would say there's a great need for research in this area.
Okay. All right. I don't know who to direct this one to, but I will ask Margaret first, and then the rest of our colleagues. A question from someone in the disability community, and part of their connection to this work is around the accessibility, employment, and independent living parts of the analysis. Does this model connect all of these pieces together, and can the people who are working as disability advocates use this information in a way that would be helpful to them?
Yes, absolutely. We have been partnering with the disability community in our Portland area work pretty much from the beginning, and we think there's a lot of crossover. And of course, the more groups that align themselves together and collaborate, the stronger the effort can be. So I would say that there's really a lot of opportunity to collaborate, and that the age-friendly, as Cathy said, when we're talking about building age-friendly communities, we're really talking about building communities for all ages, and we are all going to age with any luck. So there's a certain element of self-interest too, but certainly aligning older adult advocates and disability advocates to make this case for communities that work better for people with disabilities, whether they are young, middle-aged, or old, is going to be a really effective strategy.
Cathy or Catherine, anything to add to that?
No, Margaret did a great job.
Okay. Okay. Here's a question about a more specific question about housing, and I'll aim it towards Catherine, but anyone can jump in. If a housing developer wants to develop smaller scale housing, which would enable older people to downsize and stay in their community, what would you say to opponents who theorize that only families with small children will move in there and then they'll overcrowd the schools? Or what about this issue about, let's make it a more general question. Are we looking at, potentially engaging in intergenerational warfare at the worst? So is this argument about who's the most economically valuable, younger people or older people, going to lead us in a direction where we're going to bring more conflict between these generations?
I think that is a really excellent question, John, and I know that all of us on the phone have had some great conversations about that. And that's why I think what Cathy mentioned is that all of the data around this needs to be framed really well, so that is never the conclusion. I think that's where we are trying to go with some of the value proposition work, which is that what we're talking about when we're talking about age-friendly communities, we're also really, that is equated to age-diverse communities, where you've got people of all ages and all abilities. And some of the economics fall apart if you have a community of only older people, in the same way that they fall apart when you have only young people, all accessing the system, whatever system that is, at the same time. So I think that's where this next level of work is going, can really eliminate the opportunity for folks to take one piece of the argument and have it hold up, because what we're saying is it's age-diversified communities. So we need communities of all ages, because we don't want an empty elementary school. That's no good, a big waste of money, and never very good for property values and all kinds of things. But every time we have trailers outside of those schools, we know that the facility isn't adequate and so forth. So it really is about building the case, not that a community for all people is just a good thing to do or the right thing to do, but it actually is the economically smart thing to do. And I hope that we'll continue to be able to do work to push that and make it really concrete, because at the end of the day, a local government's got to balance their budget on a yearly basis, and we need it to get all the way down into that level.
Well, thank you so much. At this point, unfortunately, even though we have a number of questions left, we're going to have to turn back to our speakers and ask each of them to give us their final words of wisdom before we close out. So, Margaret, we will start with you.
My final word of wisdom would be to pay a lot of attention to Cathy's comments about the strategies that they've used at MARC in terms of getting the word out. These are similar to strategies that we've used, only I think Kansas City has used them even more effectively. Word of mouth, going to Rotary clubs and going to chambers of commerce. We've got a meeting with business leaders that I'm missing the beginning of right now to talk about these issues of older workforce and the benefits of age-friendly communities. But we need to be talking this work up in our communities, and these are great strategies that Cathy mentioned.
Well, Cathy, we'll turn to you next.
Well, I think first, because the Portland State University report is much general than what Catherine and the MARC, because they're very geographic specific, is that it's a wonderful document for you all to, if you haven't looked at it yet, to do that, and with your staffs or with your boards and to community conversations. It's an excellent document to that would elicit some really great conversation just within your own business or within your own staffs. I think another is that and Catherine may have alluded this to you, and if you can't tell, we're all a part of a mutual admiration society, that there are many of us out there across the country, and we're all in this together. And you have our contact information, and we have a vast set of networks too that we can connect you with, that it's important to know that you are not in this alone. Grantmakers in Aging is also just a phenomenal resource to help grapple with these issues. But I think the economic benefit of age-friendly communities is that we have a start on this, and certainly that's going to grow. But I think that it's important just to know that it's a piece of a larger puzzle, and that there's a large network out there to support you.
Thank you. And Catherine, you have the last word?
I would only add, I think, to what Margaret and Cathy have already said, in that this is a big effort, and it's wonderful to be working with so many great people. And I have yet to meet anyone working on this topic who doesn't want you to steal all their best ideas. I would maybe add one more thing, that I think all of us who are working in the field of supporting older people, whether you've been in the field a year or 30 years, we know that one of our biggest challenges is misconceptions about growing older, people's reluctance to understand that it isn't always about loss and deficit, and that while we really have some very significant challenges supporting older and frail people, and certainly those on lower incomes in the community, any opportunity we have to help people stop and rethink maybe their old ideas or stereotypes about older people as a very powerful one. And I have found that every time I share Margaret's report, the Kansas example, or even some of our work here, that it is an important part of that larger issue of helping everyone know that doing this thing called aging in the 21st century is a brand new and exciting thing, and probably the only thing that's going to hold us back is some of our old ideas about what it means.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Margaret Neal, the Director of the Institute on Aging and Professor of Community Health at Portland State University, Catherine Lawler, the Director of the Area Agency on Aging at the Atlanta Regional Commission, and Cathy Boyer-Schessel, the Project Manager for KC Communities for All Ages at the Mid-America Regional Council in the Kansas City region. I want to thank them for their participation in today's program and for all that you do to make life better for older adults. I also want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation and the AARP Foundation for their continuing support of this series and this program today. We will be making this presentation available to anyone who wishes to view it later, including the slides and audio. Please watch for the rebroadcast link, which will be on our website at www.giaging.org, or contact us at info@giaging.org. For the funders in the group, I want to remind you that we'll be out in beautiful Portland, Oregon, Dr. Neal's hometown, for our annual conference coming up on October 26th to 28th. and there is more information on the GIA website. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.